Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Covenant Cast. I'm your host, Zach.
And I'm Steven, and today we are joined by one of our favorites, DC from Steamforged Games, and we'll be talking about designing Godtear.
All right, so we met DC, just so everyone listening or watching has a context here. DC, back in 2009, 2010, you were working on developing Monster Apocalypse. We've stayed in touch since then at various conventions, like here at Adepticon, where we're recording
Not just
this.
developing Monster Apocalypse, visiting Tulsa for MonCon 2010.
That's right, the OG.
Incredible times, yeah.
And, you know, we stayed in touch. You ended up at Steamforged Games, working on Guild Ball and Dark Souls.
Yep.
And now you're working on Godtear, which is a game that has piqued our interest as of late. So before we dive into what Godtear is, I'd be curious to get a quick little, who is DC and how did DC end up as a game developer / designer at Steamforged?
Well, I've always been interested in games and even interested in designing and developing games without even realizing it. I would pull the dice out of all different board games and assign them to different toys and force my dad to play these miniatures games with me that I didn't even know what a miniatures game was.
They're writing in the sand on this.
Had notebooks full of basically RPGs when I didn't even know what an RPG was that I'd force my kid brother to play, like all that kind of stuff growing up. And then once I started my professional life as a power and controls engineer, I was not enjoying it. So I focused more and more on my hobby, and starting around 99, 2000, started doing some freelance game development. Did a little bit of RPG stuff, did some things with Twilight Creations for a while there, worked on a miniatures game that didn't really get very far, worked on a card game that didn't really get very far with different companies and different people, and it was all a good learning experience, and was even able to meet various people in the industry and get more involved in competitive gaming, and eventually that led to getting heavily involved in War Machine, both in the tournament scene, as a playtest group lead.
You were kind of a rock star, right?
A no-quarter writer, all different things that were part of it. Like, I remember that.
I heard somebody told me that you had won some one of the great titles with every different faction. Like you were you were this mastermind of War Machine.
I was trying to win a tournament with every single Warcaster at the time, which was a lot and seemed undoable. I didn't quite make it. But
close.
Yeah, I got semi-close. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But yeah, it was a good time and a good learning experience, especially getting to see more of a miniatures games, playtesting processes, and being able to then have some input on that. And eventually they brought me on board full-time in 2008, I believe. And before too long, I was the development manager there, working on projects, like you said, Monster Apocalypse, working on some War Machine, working on various card games, some board games, even a little bit on the role-playing game, like just really building that experience. In 2015, I stopped working with Privateer Press, and in 2016, I started working at Steamforged Games, where I became the head of game development there. But due to recent personal changes in my life, my new baby girl, Lexi, who was born on December 6th, I have shifted into more of a part-time contract consultant type direction, and am still pretty involved in kind of the front end of projects, but less of the day-to-day development than I used to be.
So more design, a little less development.
For the most part, yeah. I mean, or early development, kind of in between, kind of bridge the gap.
So at Steamforged, I don't know when it was that you guys announced Godtear in the first place, but you've been doing an alpha test, right? Which is very interesting, along with a lot of other really interesting choices made on kind of how Godtear is coming about. So before we even start getting into those, what is Godtear? If someone doesn't know, if they haven't been listening to John on the podcast every week, then what's the elevator pitch, right? Like one or two sentences of here's what Godtear is.
So in a world where all of the gods have died and their essence rained down to this fantasy earth, these God tiers, these crystals, are a toxic, face melty substance that will kill you. Unless you are chosen. Unless you are one of the chosen, one of these champions who, rather than being face melted by the Godtears, are instead empowered by them. It increases their strength, their intelligence, their physical size, even, as you can see from the models, where there are giant dwarfs, although that seems a little bit weird. But you get the point.
A little oxymoronic there.
And so these champions then seek out more and more of these Godtears, and they draw followers to themselves who will help them to attain godhood and create this new pantheon.
And then that pantheon does the same kind of cycle, right? Isn't that the idea that, well, like...
Yeah, in 23,700 years, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We got some time then.
We got some time.
And so then they will, like, ascend, and then Godtears will rain down yet again, and then the whole cycle continues.
The robots that inevitably take over. So that's a theme, right? And the cool thing about this to me, and I think what makes it very interesting, before, I've only played a couple of times. I got a demo at Gamma, and I played a couple games with John because we got one of the alpha sets to kind of try it out and check out the models and stuff. And, you know, the game itself is something we'll get to in a little bit. But maybe even more interesting is all the choices that aren't even the game itself. A really great example of this to me is, I mean, you're doing the alpha test in general, which is crazy, I'm sure, as a designer or developer. But even the reality that there's no point costs on models, or there's no factions.
Well, and the point cost one is interesting because my first real experience digging into that was Monster Apocalypse. Every monster had a cost of one monster.
Yeah, that's
and so
that's true. I didn't even think about
monster,
that.
one hyperform.
You can't give one particular monster better stats and just increase their point cost. And here it's the same type of thing. You also have it in Guild Ball, unless it's a captain or a mascot who have their own strata. Every Guild Ball player is one player. You can't just tweak their cost. You've got to get them to fit that power level of a single player. And the champions, like you said, it's the same sort of thing. You've got to find that balance that doesn't rely on being able to just tweak one number up or down. You've got to find a happy medium that will give them a reason to play that champion, but not so that it's excluding other ones. And it's a tough kind of unity balance sort of thing that comes up often enough as we're talking about it in different forms and in different ways, but it is a challenge for sure.
So on that note, we've run into a lot of games over the years where, you know, you print the pieces and everything's in play and it's in the environment, and there are no real, like, built-in mechanisms to have that moment of, well, we need to correct something and we don't really know exactly how we're going to do that. Is that something that you guys are considering moving forward? Like, how are we going to make tweaks as the game is actually living?
Well, and part of this is driven by the digital world. In a digital card game, in a digital, I'm going to call it a miniatures game, a MOBA, you have the capability of tweaking a number here, tweaking a number there, and just really kind of fixing things, especially in some of these games where it's like, oh, we've changed this value from 1,021 to 1,019, and now it's balanced. It's like, you can't usually do that with a board game or a miniatures game. Yeah. But people, gamers, are starting to want that. And I think that even started fairly long ago when people started looking at more of these modern gaming aspects to their miniatures gaming, wanting more cool combos to do, wanting more layers to think about, wanting a deeper sense of doing your army building and making your choices before the game, the meta game. So I think we've been moving that way for a long time, and finding the best way, the optimum way to keep a physical game able to be dynamic like that is challenging. I think you guys might have already heard War Machine has moved away from physical cards.
Yeah.
Their cards are digital now, so they can make those dynamic updates. And I think other people will continue to do that same sort of thing where it makes sense. In some games, it's harder than others because of the role the cards play in playing the game. But where it's feasible, I think it makes a lot of sense because you can continue that development. People have said for a long time, the day a game comes out, you'll get more play testing done than the entire development cycle.
Yeah.
No matter what you're talking about, no matter what type of game it is.
Yeah, because you immediately just have thousands of people playing your game. So, I mean, to all the various choices like that, getting rid of the factions and getting rid of the point cost from, or not even getting rid of, not even including from the start. What's the goal behind that, right? Because like you could have had point costs, and that does give you the option of, you know, Rangosh can be this many more points or this many less points, and you can balance in that way. But what do you think the upsides to not having those truly are?
I think that a big piece of it is the freedom for the player. It's a lot easier, even when there aren't wide degrees of different point costs, even just having different point costs at all, it puts extra barriers in the way of the player to trying something new. If I'm playing Godtear and there's a new champion on the shelf and I'm like, whoa, that looks cool, I want to try that. Take any one champion out off the table, put that guy on the table, play. Like being able to tear down that barrier, I think makes it more accessible, and that accessibility is one of the recurring themes behind this game. The rulebook is the shortest rulebook certainly I've ever worked on for a miniatures game.
How long is it right now?
The Word doc is about 9 pages before the glossary.
That's awesome.
Even with lots of pictures, you're talking about the core rules for a miniatures game being about 12 pages probably.
And the interesting thing about that is when I played with John, I don't remember looking at the rule book. That was maybe my favorite part, is that he had played before, and there's some fundamentals that you understand, right? Where it's like, I have 3 movement. Yeah, it's like, okay, I can move 3 spaces. I get it. And then, you know, the back glossary, like there were some keywords that you had to look up occasionally. But like we were playing our first game, and that's really a great sign to me, is that it was so intuitive that I never even had to read through the rule book.
Right.
And as someone who's not fond of rule books,
You're not a big rule book reader.
I'm not a reader over here.
We got a reader.
Well, and that even came up doing demos today. Like people who are gamers sit down and you start explaining things, and you get to a point where you're just watching as the demoer, even just in the first turn, because it's like, okay, I've got it now. I do this. These are my actions. This is what this guy does. And we tried to build it very intuitively as much as we could.
Well, so walking through basically that early game process, if I think I'm a prospective player, you know, and I'm walking into a store, and I'm thinking about how Godtear is going to work in this instance, and it's like, okay, here's the thing. I know that I need 3 champions, and then they come with a couple of follower units up to like 1 to 5, depending on the champion. And I can go up and I can grab those 3 things, and then I can buy those, and then they're pre-assembled, so I don't have to get my glue and my clippers and all of that to start to actually put it together and then play. I unbox those things, and then I go over to a table where you have a very short, ultimately, board as compared to most miniatures games that fits easily. Like our tables are generally like for card game situations.
Yeah.
So like our skinny tables fits the board just fine, right? So you walk over there, and then you say, oh man, I don't even need a tape measure because you've got hexes on this board. So I put my 3 champions down and my followers, and I'm starting, right? I'm starting to play. How many of those decisions, I'm fascinated by this, because this to me is such an encouraging, so encouraging, that it seems like it started with, we need to solve all the problems that we find in miniature games. And of course, with your experience with Guild Ball, you probably see and hear what is keeping new players out of kind of adapting this game into their arsenal. So was that the framework by which you started designing a game? Or was that kind of, were you designing a game and then it's like, well, we need to add this because of new players, or we need to add this because it will be easy? What was the framework for when you started designing?
Well, this is something that kind of comes back for me to both Charles Agel and Matt Hart, because both of them independently have talked a lot about what at least Matt calls the Christmas morning experience. I don't know what term Charles uses for it, but it's something that he's been pushing for long before he was at Steamforged Games, something that he's really been focused on. And that is being able to open a box and play with something and enjoy it like you want to do on Christmas. You don't want something that you're going to be able to enjoy in a month or two. You want something that you can enjoy right now and have that cup of cocoa and have that log on the fire and be like, this is the thing. This is the day I wait all year for. And to have an experience like that where you can just open it up, you don't have to go find a tape measure somewhere. You don't need a million little widgets. You don't have to have a dry erase marker. You don't need the glue. Like, you're able to play. And that's not to say that the peripherals for various games aren't good. They can be very helpful. but you don't need them. You can open the box and play. And one of the things I've pushed for more and more is the rulebook side of things. It's great that we've now made it to the point where you have everything you need in a box. We've kind of taken that board game mindset and applied it to a miniatures game successfully. That's great. But if it still takes someone an hour or more to read the rule book, go watch a whole series of videos on YouTube, like we don't want that either.
Yeah.
We want to kind of cut that down now to just a few pages. You can figure this out and be playing pretty quickly, and that's the goal. That's the ideal.
It's pretty crazy because you reference the problems with miniature games, and I think defining what a problem is.
At least the problems that I have with traditional miniature games, I guess I should verify that.
Because I mean, I think there is a certain amount of a lot of people that have been in the industry for a while and been part of this. They take a lot of joy in, even today, Star Wars Legion came out, right? And people I see posting about being excited, opening all these models, having to put them together and do the hobby thing and customize them.
You already said having to put them together, right? Yeah. Getting to put them together.
Getting the opportunity to put them together. But, for me, like I came from very much a card game background.
Right.
And so did you. And then Monster Apocalypse came out, and it was a pre-assembled, pre-painted miniatures game with no point costs. Which makes a lot of sense why we would actually make that leap. And then in X-Wing, same thing, pre-assembled, pre-painted miniatures. And so for me and for a lot of people that we've seen in our store and in our community online, there's just a massive barrier between them and a game like Warhammer, War Machine, these bigger games that you have to buy all these models and put them all together. And so having this, that's kind of the leap for me, which is having a game that is solving those problems. And that's where I would be curious. Did it start there to solve the problems? Or, because then the next question is the game itself good, right?
Well, sure. and there's also the whole other opposite end of the spectrum, because that's how it looks from a card gamer's background.
Yeah.
But then you've got guys like a lot of the people here at this particular show. Adepticon is such a big miniatures gamer show, more so than any other show I can think of in the US. And their terrain crew, those guys are amazing. They build all kinds of awesome stuff for all different game systems and put tons of time into it. And they spend more time building terrain and painting minis and assembling minis even, and actually cleaning them first, which you should do, but
I'm with you.
You're excited,
I'm not a rulebook reader, I'm not a model cleaner, I'll say that.
But the people who love that, they'll spend 10 times as much time on those things as
That's
they do
more
ever
important, isn't it? Really, in a lot of ways.
Just the hobby.
Yeah. So you don't want to alienate those people either. You want models that are pretty enough to paint and like enticing enough to paint, but also that you can still hit the people who just want to pop open a box and throw some stuff on a table.
Yeah.
And so it's the two different sides of it brought together into the middle without sacrificing anything too critical to either side that becomes a real challenge.
And you think you've hit that? You think that Godtear hits that middle ground?
I hope so. I think we'll know more in another month or two. Part of it is just the way I approach things, but to me, Godtear is still growing very much. It's still evolving. Even something like how we cut down the number of dice from what used to be a greater number of different dice within the game to the current version, there's far fewer. We're probably only going to have 2 different types of dice in the entire game if we stay on the track we're on.
So you're doing the alpha test now, right? And I've seen you guys, you're on like version 6 consistently. You're updating that thing.
Yep.
We don't know what version DC's on, though.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
He's
6. I'm on 6. Yeah, that's what we said we're going to bring to Adepticon. We just finished version 6 Tuesday night.
Well, it was like last week that version 5 was happening.
Yeah.
It was
I mean, how fun is that to just iterate so quickly and push it out?
Well, you keep talking about the early access, and it's what we always do. It's just the public's actually seeing what we always do.
Yeah, does that make you nervous?
Somewhat, but I think that it also provides a good perspective too. Because a lot of times you see people are like, oh, wonder why they didn't try that. That would have been the perfect answer. It's like, we did try that 8 revisions ago, and it messed up this, and then this didn't work.
Yeah.
And so having people able to see more of that, it's a mixed blessing. Like, I get excited about the people who start really understanding the process better, But it's also a little frustrating to see the people who think they have the silver bullet that you tried 9 months ago.
Well, and how long were you working on Godtear before you went into the alpha test?
It's hard to put a specific number on it because it really has been off and on since fall 2016.
Okay.
Nice.
There
That's
were
when the
times-
ideas started to kind of start ticking up.
Yep. That was when, well, and Matt might say longer. That's
Yeah.
when I started having meetings with Matt on it, and we started putting different pieces of it together. And some of those pieces stayed pretty consistent throughout, and other pieces got streamlined or changed or removed or added. Like, it's just evolved so much since the beginning.
You ultimately got the gig at Privateer from being a playtester, right?
Partly from my tournament record, from playtesting, from writing for No Quarter.
So
I feel like I'm forgetting something too, because there was a lot. I was very involved. I spent a lot of time on just being a War Machine player, probably more than my job, which is bad. Don't do that.
in that space, that playtesting, you've obviously spent a lot of time on the outside as a playtester for a game. What are some things you wish or would like for playtesters of Godtear to know or to like improve on in terms of feedback? Because I can imagine that you have this early alpha, and you know, even us, we're looking at the models and playing the game. We're like, we think maybe this could be different. This could be different. But obviously, just shooting all that feedback out into space is not the best way to playtest.
Right.
So what are the things that you would like to see people kind of understand more about the playtesting process and how to do it well?
Yeah, so it's getting pretty close to 20 years that I've been doing playtesting in some capacity or another, whether it's just playtesting somebody's rough ideas that eventually did or didn't become a game, to the War Machine Mark II field test, which was a huge effort, to now the early access stuff for Godtear. Like, there's so many different pieces of it and different perspectives on it. Whether it's games that I made or games that I ran the playtesting for somebody else, and whether I was a playtester. And some of the things that kind of come from all of that put together are in the documentation we put up for the early access, and said, hey, these are some things to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. But it's human nature to not read the rules, to jump in, and that's understandable. So, like, just to, as like kind of the biggest points, I think one of the toughest things is leaving last week behind. So when there's a new edition of the rules, not to base the feedback on on the delta, but basing the feedback on what is. Because if you see a model and it's super, like, let's say it's crazy overpowered, and it's just ruining the game, and then the next week it's toned down slightly, your mind might be like, oh, it's better now, when it's still a problem. Or you might be like, and maybe it's perfectly balanced, and you're like, oh, it's not enough. It was so bad before. You have to go farther. Like, there's so many ways that our brains can trick us into not starting fresh in a system where we really need to start fresh.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, please focus on what the focus is at the time. All of the like nitty-gritty balance feedback of this number should be one lower in version 0.1, none of it means anything now. At that point in time, and even now, our focus needs to be on the engine, on the system, because we don't even know what color of paint the car is going to be, much less the exact detailing of it that you're so focused on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so you guys, Gamma revealed that your Kickstarter is supposed to go live in April. Mm-hmm. So I don't assume the game will get to 1.0 by then.
Correct.
What is your kind of internal objective as far as actually getting to a point where this game, how long is the alpha test going to go for, I guess, is the question.
So one thing I just want to throw out there, because this conversation and this topic does come up quite a bit, and there have been people saying, oh, it's way too early, it's way too early. Kickstarter is allowed to be early. If we look at where Dark Souls was during the Kickstarter versus where it wound up, if we look at where Guild Ball was during the Kickstarter versus where it wound up, Godtear is already, somebody might disagree with this, but I firmly believe personally, Godtear is already miles past where those games were when they kickstarted. There's still plenty of development to do, but when the Kickstarter for Dark Souls ended kind of the first thing that Steamforged did was set up a development week, get a whole bunch of guys together in one room and start just hammering on all the different aspects and systems and mechanics of that game. And we're already past that point for Godtear. So I don't know, we will not be at 1.0 when the Kickstarter goes live. But we'll have cool stuff to look at, and we'll have a lot of things figured out that hopefully people will be able to watch and say, oh, I really dig that aspect of the gameplay. And it's going to be down to the fine tuning rather than down to building the foundation.
Sure.
I definitely want to get to Godtear, the game, like really quickly. But since we're there, we always are asking ourselves and guests, ultimately, what you think about Kickstarter in the tabletop industry, right? This is a big kind of disruptive mechanic, one of the first that we've seen. But I just want to get DC's quick take on Kickstarter and what it means for tabletop games.
I think that it has a fascinating impact on developers, retailers, publishers, customers. I think there's so many different pieces of that puzzle. And I think in some ways it's part of an even bigger picture. I think we've seen, as far as I can tell, more direct sales setups in the past couple of decades than any time previously in this industry, which is another interesting thing. And then you start looking at the philosophy behind stretch goals and how they're used, and profit margins and what they can really represent. If you've got a product on the shelf in a game store, you probably are only getting 20 to 10% of that money as the people who made the game.
Yeah.
The rest goes to the manufacturer of the game, shipping the game, any sort of like various tariffs and stuff, all kinds of things, especially in an international world. The publisher or the distributor's cut, the retailer's money that's needed to keep their employees paid and their lights on and their building paid for. Like, so when 10 to 20% is what actually goes to the developer versus in direct sales, 80%, 90%, you just have to manufacture it and ship it directly.
Yeah.
Versus in Kickstarter, where you've got another way of looking at things. And so it skews perspectives so much. Because when people look at, oh, I can get all of this on Kickstarter. And it's like, it's $500 worth of game for $100 because of how profit margins work. Mm-hmm. Not because that's what the game should cost. They can't charge $100 for that in the store. It does not work.
Yeah.
The system just completely breaks down. And so there have been some really cool experiments with it. There's also been some really unfortunate shifts with it. I think that the saddest part is how few games that I think were kind of the soul of Kickstarter, how few of them succeed anymore. Because those games are I've got a great idea. I don't have a giant art budget. I don't have a $2,000 video or more. I don't have big names. I'm not going to get on Geek and Sundry, but I've got an awesome idea. And I have play tested the hell out of this for years with everyone I could get my hands on and gone to all these different unpublished game developer events. And I have got a great game. And knowing that that's probably going to fail because it doesn't have $500 in miniatures in it for $100.
Interesting.
Yeah. But that is interesting. I think, as a tool, it could obviously be used to let games get to market that otherwise wouldn't be justifiable, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because that cost structure is so much lower. So games that don't make sense in the old model actually can exist thanks to Kickstarter. But
it's a possibility.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, they're getting covered up now by kind of the bigger...
Well, I mean, and even the bigger guys sometimes need it.
Mm-hmm. Steamforged among them, right? You guys have kickstarted everything, right?
Most things.
Most the main titles.
But all the things that have a high startup cost. Because that's what it comes down to. When you start looking at what the molds cost for, especially in plastic, just the startup cost for a game can be $100,000, $200,000, and most companies don't have that in this industry, don't have that lying around. Yeah. You can't just throw that at a new project. Sure. So Kickstarter allows you to raise that money and then take care of that production and then keep your own lights on and then sell the game.
One of the challenges with Kickstarter that's interesting that I feel like Dark Souls, just based on the stats we got from Gamma, kind of did well was, it does make sense if you otherwise couldn't produce your game. This lets you potentially bring it to market. But obviously, if you're selling it direct, then the reality of retail, the standard chain wanting to carry it and support it and build communities around it is much lower. Because I remember the example I always use is Relic Knights. They pre-sold like 3 years worth of miniatures.
Yeah.
And then by the time it came out, like a year and a half later, excitement had kind of died down, and also the typical chain didn't really want anything to do with it because the first 3 years of models had been sold.
But you've also got the price point issue, and that it shows up a lot. I talked about getting $500 of models for $100. Dark Souls, you've got some of that. Relic Knights, you had some of that. Like, so many examples of all of the big projects, you just got all these extras if you backed it on Kickstarter. So if someone's like, oh, hey, you got to go pick up this game, look at all these awesome things I got for $100, and then they go to the store and they see it's $500. Yeah. Some sticker shock there.
And the other thing too, Dark Souls sold a ton outside of Kickstarter.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
A massive
amount. They were saying that like a sixth went through Kickstarter, and the other 5/6 so far have gone through the retail. And that's also another. I mean, this is the whole topic. We've talked about.
We'll get to Godtear. We get to Godtear.
Because then we could also diverge onto IPs and licensing, and like there's we need a couple of podcasts today. Could talk games, just like random stuff we think about.
For a couple
games.
Days, yeah.
I was going to go with years, but sure, at least a couple days.
Yeah. Well, I like to get to things pretty quick, snappy.
He's not a rulebook reader.
Not a reader, not a reader.
Tell me, hey, DC, what are you most excited about in terms of the game itself for Godtear? The engine. Where does the engine sing?
For me personally, the part that really grabs me is how much differentiation we've packed into such a simple system. When you play different champions, even if you're not switching their classes, but even just taking a couple of the champions from the same class, but different ones of them, it feels like a different game. And what's across the table can make it feel like a different game. And the options that are available to you, even just switching one guy out for somebody else, suddenly it's like, oh, I could do that to him, and they could provide that benefit here, or that to the opponent, and that. And like, it's a very combo-based system, despite its thin rulebook.
Yeah. Tell me, this is a very bizarre question that we had as we were driving up to Chicago. What's the purpose of blanks on dice? Because there's a very strong element to say that like there's a lot of not good feeling in like just whiffing on things, and having a baseline of success maybe being leading to less like really disappointed moments during gameplay.
So we could get into a lot of philosophy or psychology if we wanted to. I don't think we're going to quite
as much as you can afford to give
us. Maybe a little. But a lot of times people look at dots that are there as like a thing that's there, but they still might do nothing.
Right.
Right. If you have a system where there are no blanks, but you're going up against needing to beat a number, you can do nothing just as easily as if you have blanks and are going up against nothing. Or depending on what's on the dice, if you have blanks and pips but are going against a small fixed value, like it's all just in our heads.
Right.
And so if we have the baseline be some blanks, some pips, and the lowest this number can be is 0, that's the least math for anybody to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the quickest. Is it psychologically the best? Maybe, maybe not. The other piece of it, though, and I'm going to tangent a little on this one.
Please.
For quite a few years of my game development life, I would preach, for lack of a better word, that there are better CCGs than Magic the Gathering. But Magic the Gathering is still on top. And at some point in the last 20 years, it hit me why. Or one of the reasons.
Yeah, I'm ready.
One of the many reasons.
So ready.
One of the many reasons. And that is that you could have a kid who just got a starter pack, the ones that's just commons and 2 uncommons and some lands that they hand out for free at conventions. And he could beat the top pro player in the world. Not every time, not even probably 1% of the time, but on that any given Sunday, that little kid could beat the best Magic player in the world because of how mana works. And plenty of other games have had alternate mana systems where you can use your mana differently or your mana scales differently, and it gets rid of some of those problems. But those problems are only problems to certain people, and they're solutions, for lack of a better word, to the other people. Like that swinginess is good and bad, both. So if I've got 1 dodge die and you've got 5 accuracy dice, but there's still that chance that you could miss me, I'm going to look at those dice and my eyes are going to get big, and that one time you do miss is more memorable. And
yeah, it's a freak out moment. Yeah, I've been there. It's 97% chance.
So is it good or is it bad to have those moments amplified? It depends on who you are and who you're targeting as your audience. I think for Godtear, we want more of those moments. More of those, a little kid just beat the best pro Magic player moments.
And inherently that should make it a more relaxed environment, right? Because you can't be so cerebral about your decision making.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who will still take it that way and take it that far, but I think who it appeals to mostly is going to shift that a little bit. You're not going to have as many of those people who are so invested that they're breaking tables because they just lost 1 die roll. You're losing at least one die roll every single game. You're going to have some good, you're going to have some bad. You just got to take it all as it comes.
So speaking of the audience for the game, one of the other pretty crazy and different and awesome choices is the focus on campaign/story-driven play over competitive tournament play. Not that tournament play won't exist, that's not the case. But at the same time, specifically coming out and saying, no, our focus is going to be on campaign, story-driven league, that kind of play. How does that change the design development process for you? Because that's obviously a very different kind of audience to be designing for.
Well, one of the things that most kind of crunched our work on the early parts of the game was realizing that we need an entire campaign system in this rulebook, or at least in this product. We need an entire miniatures game in here. We need a system for playing casual games, just one-off games. Like this needs to be, if this is going to be all of these different things, then we need to account for that and keep each of those individual things as simple as possible while allowing them to be as deep as is reasonable to make them. And that was just a huge realization and a huge challenge together.
Tell me about the 4 different types of champions in the game, especially coming from, so this is kind of it started this MOBA, like Dota, League of Legends, like this kind of inspiration, right? Here's the Storm, correct? Yes. And that has kind of, as I've kind of started to really look at Godtear, there are elements of that for sure. Like you have your champions and kind of those units that are recurring and coming back. And one of the cool things about the game, nothing's ever really off the board. I mean, it kind of is always just resetting and coming back, so it feels like that endless rain of creeps coming at you. But in a lot of ways, it's definitely not, you're not going down lanes and farming gold and buying items and that kind of thing. So where is the line between MOBA and something new? And I wonder, are you trying to get the Dota players, the MOBA players to come and give the physical world a shot? Is that what you're going to go out and try to get?
I certainly think that would be great if we could do that. But kind of at the base level, I think it's more of an inspiration, certainly, than a simulation, just like you pointed out. There are people out there who have made some pretty cool games that are very MOBA-driven and MOBA-themed. I have had the opportunity to play test several of them at different Unpub events and stuff, and it's a common thing that people have tried to do. I haven't seen one yet that really nailed it for me, and part of that is because anytime you're taking something and putting it in a new format, and this would fit great into our licensing and IP podcast we'll have sometime, or
That's
discussion.
Right. See you next year.
But it is how much you abstract and how much you simulate. And you really need to find what's the core hook of this game. Like what makes this game tick, and expound upon that. Because Dark Souls, the board game, is more of a simulation than Dark Souls, the card game is. But Dark Souls, the card game, still has those elements of kill stuff to get their souls, be challenged and sometimes die. Like these core things that make that Dark Souls experience. And so I think when we look at the MOBA, the piece of it that we really wanted is a piece that I don't think is specific to just MOBAs either. You look at something like Overwatch, and it's got that same hook. And that hook is these characters that are over the top, individual, each one feels different, and done in fairly simple ways. Like in the MOBAs too, you've got even just a little change can make such a big difference between a hero that really is geared towards getting up there and blocking opposing movement, taking a lot of damage, versus a hero that maybe has a similar theme and even a slightly similar style and moveset, but just tweaking the numbers, and suddenly they don't want to be up close. They want to be farther back, and they want to be gearing towards trying to get someone alone, or all these different little things that are caused by small changes. And that's the piece of it that we really wanted, and I think that ties back into what you were saying about the classes.
Yeah, the 4 classes, right?
Yeah, and the number of classes, what the classes are, have changed a lot over time. We also wanted to be, Alex and I, after talking about all the different possibilities and these giant lists of different classes we could have, we didn't want it to be something surface. In some games, the difference between a class is, oh, well, that's a physical damage class, and that's a magical damage class.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really make the difference. Like, what type of damage you're dealing doesn't create this huge change in what the character does. So we really wanted to boil it down to, within this game system, what are the different types of things you could be trying to do? And so we wound up with Guardians, Slayers, Maelstroms, and Shapers, where the Guardians, in some way or another, they are protecting your game plan, protecting your warband, and that can be so many different ways. You could have everything from this super fragile necromancery mage guy who constantly brings all your guys back. That could be a Guardian. Or you could have a guy who literally can't be knocked out, and that could be a Guardian. Nice. Where one has infinity wounds, and one literally has 1, and they could both be Guardians, because it's not about how many wounds you have or what your armor stat is. Sure. It's about they're supposed to protect, bolster my force. Slayers are the assassins from Heroes of the Storm, anyway.
Yeah.
If we are paralleling the MOBAs, that's the one that's probably most parallel.
Sure. Yeah.
No matter what
the
system,
hero killers, if you will.
Right. Whatever system we're talking about, you've got your guys who are some sort of assassin in the game, some sort of a hero killer, like you said, and that's the Slayers. They have the highest damage output. They have tools for increasing that more or decreasing the defense or damage resistance of their opponents. They want to take out the champions, which, like you said, doesn't end that champion's part of the game, but gives you a lot of points.
Yeah.
Your Maelstroms kind of go the opposite route, and they focus more on the followers and on a bit of mobility. So really kind of being everywhere, taking out opening up the paths. They're one of the only classes that, well, they are the only class that commonly has abilities to take out multiple models at a time. Cool. It is usually those weak follower models, never champions, because that's a Slayer's job. But that's kind of where the Maelstroms live. And the Shapers, Alex Shaver is a guy who works with us sometimes, does demos and stuff for Steamforged Games. He's been playing some Godtear today, and we jokingly started calling him Alex Shaper because he just loves the scenario versatility of the Shapers. They can change where things are positioned with the objectives, with what's called the banners, which help claim the objectives, a lot of different mobility tricks. And one of the things that I think is a lot of fun about a game of Godtear is, sure, the you can play various scenarios, you can play the campaign, there's all these different pieces that come together, but even just the game itself can be so different from game to game based on what you're playing, what your opponent's playing. You could go into one game just wanting to slaughter everything you see, and then go into the next game and not even bother using a single skill that does damage. If you wanted to. You're just focusing really on the objectives, on manipulating the battlefield, and all of that is viable.
So do you feel like you need that synergy across various roles, or could you bring the 3 Guardian list and get something done?
I think that depends who you are, what your answer to that question is. I think there are people out there who will say you have to cover your bases, you have to cover your strengths and weaknesses. There are going to be people out there who want to just form a game plan and go for it. And I think that it makes a lot of sense for Steamforged to do a miniatures game like this because of the experiences we've had with Guild Ball. Because Guild Ball has some of what we're saying here translates so directly. Because you can play a Guild Ball team and you can go for 6 takeouts, or you could go for 3 goals, or you could go for something in the middle, and that same philosophy applies here, and we can use some of the same experience and knowledge we've gained to make these different paths viable in different ways and for different people, and give us a nice breadth of a roster that's still distinct enough from one another.
And that doesn't even begin to talk about campaign style play, right? So like when you say campaign story driven play, I know that that's still pretty early in the process, but like what's the kind of idea behind that? How is that going to function in Godtear?
Well, you'll have stuff and it'll get better.
But this is actually really important, right? So it's over probably like a quarter or something, and the champions that you're playing will literally gain new skills and abilities as they go along through the league, right?
Yeah,
that's
or tournament.
insane.
A single tournament can be the same thing.
You could. I think it would make more sense in kind of the open play over a 4-day convention or something than a tournament.
Oh, man,
but
that
you could
like a
do
good
a
time.
tournament style.
Yeah, like all weekend at Adepticon, you can be building your champion.
Yeah. It's a little too early for me to try to give
But that's
any
kind of like
specifics.
the idea, right? Like,
But
not
yes,
specific at all,
yeah,
but
yeah.
the fact that you could have a character that starts pretty basic and maybe is a shaper or a guardian, and then over a 2, 3, 4 day or week or month period, kind of customizing, becoming your own,
Feeling
and
like
also
yours,
potentially
right?
like telling a story, right? Like I know in Guild Ball, story was a part of it, where there's new seasons every year,
Right.
and things kind of advance and change. So the results from this kind of stuff could
Yeah.
steer that ship.
Well, and we have, starting at SteamCon UK of last year, we introduced the Rookie League for Guild Ball, which has a very similar vibe. We limit it, because of the complexity of Guild Ball, we limit it to just one specific player is your team's rookie for this league. And you start out, you make a couple of choices for where they start. And then whichever path you're then on, you can upgrade the front or back of the card on that path. And so you've got almost like a fairly minimalistic skill tree of where this character can go. And as you play over the course of SteamCon, or we're running it here at Adepticon, your character gets better and cooler and whatever.
That's awesome.
But in Guild Ball, it would be tough to do that for everybody.
Yeah.
And in Godtear, that's going to be one of the challenges, making it something that's broad enough, interesting enough, diverse enough, without being something that just gets cumbersome and slows the game down. Because we want to keep it that quick, fun game that doesn't kind of take you 5 minutes to read your opponent's card and understand it. You should be able to pick that guy up and be like, oh, he's going to move things around and then kill followers or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah.
So as kind of a final question before we get out of here, I would be curious to know, for people listening or watching who are maybe just now finding out about Godtear and listening to this podcast, what would you say to them that makes it worth checking Godtear out?
Well, I think that it does have kind of that extra benefit of being such a broad game. People that do enjoy that very character-driven combat will enjoy Godtear. Will be drawn already, even just in early access, in demos. People were like, oh, this guy is awesome. I can't wait to play him again. This is my man. He does all this. And somebody else would be like, I don't care about that guy.
Yeah.
So like that champion style of real personality to them, I think will draw a lot of people in. I think the accessibility will hopefully, very, very hopefully, allow people who play some of the kind of mid-weight board games to try out a miniatures game and say, hey, this is actually a lot of fun. I love how all these different pieces fit together, how there's all these different combinations. And then naturally, miniatures gamers, and then even RPG players, because where you've got that campaign style thing, I've seen a lot of various campaign miniature systems out there that people play almost because there aren't a lot of choices. It's just not a very mind area of gameplay. And so you've got people who are still playing Mordheim, the original Mordheim from, I don't know, 25 years ago?
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's crazy.
Because that's something they enjoy, but being able to give that audience something truly new with modern design sensibilities, hopefully will really resonate and really draw those folks into. So who should play Godtear? Everybody.
And the video game crowd, let's not forget. The MOBA
Right.
players of today should definitely check it out and see what we're all about in this world of physical games.
Yeah, and it seems like
a great
pretty
world.
accessible game, so even people that haven't played miniature games or this kind of game in general might very much be drawn to this.
Yeah.
So, DC, thank you so much for coming on. It was
Thank
an
you guys
absolute
for having
privilege.
me.
Yeah, thanks,
Hopefully
man. It's great
we'll
to catch up
get
with
to
you.
do this again.
Really
Thank
good.
you guys all for watching, and until next time, keep playing.